You're listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House.
Welcome, I'm Juan de Lara, Cultural Manager at Asia House, and this is our 5th episode of Art in Isolation podcast, again part of Converging Paths, an initiative in partnership with the Barca Trust that counts with the support of the Al-Tajir Trust and the Al-Khan Trust for Culture. Converging Paths, as we often mention, is meant to appreciate the creative encounters with the Islamic world. And few of you have written to me asking exactly what does Islamic world means. Well, the term Islamic world is a controversial one. By itself points to the idea of an isolated and well-defined culture or block of people defined solely by a religion. However, we know, of course, that this is far from the case, and for the countries that form what we call the Islamic world, we find a myriad of cultures, languages, and religions coexisting. After all, we don't exactly use Christian to define Europe and North America. So when we use it within this context, it usually refers to a geographical area more than a specific unified culture. The term has been widely used for Islamic art to refer to any item conceived, produced, designed, and commissioned in these geographical areas. However, as we saw in our last podcast, hardly any artifact created in the Islamic world was made for liturgical purposes. So to sum up, it is an ambiguous term, and others like Persianate and so on have been suggested, but no satisfactory alternative has yet emerged. However, I have here with me Edhem Eldem, who will be able to better help us to understand the diversity and various ideologies present in this locution by working on the example of the Ottoman Empire. Welcome, Edhem. You are a teacher at the Boğaziçi University in the Department of History. You hold the post of International Chair of Turkish and Ottoman History at the Collège de France. You also have been a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley, at Harvard, at the Columbia University, amongst many others. You have written extensively about the Ottoman Empire, the history of the archaeology, its bank, its urban development, and a bit of art.
Thank you very much.
And today we have started discussing the multiculturalism and diversity that form the Islamic world. And I feel in particular the Ottoman Empire as an empire is a great example of the complexities of cultural and social integration, which accepted differences, but still all of them could be part of one entity.
Yeah, well, it's obviously we should beware of anachronisms, and especially of imposing some kind of an intent on the Ottoman Empire as, trying to become a multiculti empire. That's not the case. I mean, the objective of the Ottomans was not to create some kind of convivencia or, a getting together of all sorts of different people, whatever. No, it's an empire, old style, a little bit like the Roman Empire. So basically it has two obsessions. One is, to keep some kind of a control over a population. Territory is not really very clearly defined. It's mostly population because at the end of the day, the real objective of an empire is to get fiscal resources, taxes, revenue from the lands that are under its control. So whether the taxpayer is Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or whatever, it doesn't really make much of a difference. In fact, there's even an advantage in the Islamic tradition to having non-Muslim taxpayers because they pay more because of the inequality of their status. What is called the dhimma in Arabic or zimmet in Turkish. The status of non-Muslims is one of inferiority that has to recognize itself in all sorts of symbolic gestures, certain colors that cannot be worn and whatever, but also some very concrete measures such as paying the capitation, the kharaj, as the Turks call it, or the jizye. It's a tax that is not paid by the Muslims, but is paid by non-Muslims. So first of all, we have to realize that if the Ottoman Empire is plural, I'm not saying pluralist, but plural, the precondition for that is to a large extent inequality. So if we look back from today's definitions of multiculturalism and whatever, we shouldn't fall into the trap of projecting back into the past some of the positive values we associate with diversity today. It's very misleading. And some people do it for political reasons or because, there's this big thing you call nostalgia of the past, and you'll have to reinvent the past in whatever way. So it's much more complicated. But yes, the Ottoman Empire is an empire. It is a multi-layered and multi-ethnic, multi-confessional structure, which is very different from contemporary Europe at the time. So if you look at the European experience in terms of managing difference, the way Europe, at least until the 19th century, manages difference is by getting rid of the different, of those who are others. This is obvious in the Spanish Reconquista. It's obvious in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 in France. It's obvious in the ghettos of Italy. It's obvious in every measure that in Europe kind of tends towards the crystallization of an identity around one single religion. That's the principle of the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, cuius regio, eius religio. So whatever the prince's religion is, the people will have the same religion. So you want to homogenize, and this you do at any cost. And some of the costs are very, very high, very violent. It goes as far as expulsion, as in the case of Iberia, or France in the 17th century. It goes even towards, massacres, pogroms, and, it's a very violent tradition. But ironically, it's a tradition that, while constituting a homogeneous body around a religious identity behind one monarch, plants the seed of the nation and therefore makes it possible to move towards equality, which is the underlying principle of democracy. Whereas in the Ottoman case, and that's one of my obsessions in trying to understand Turkish politics, for example, today, in the Ottoman case, this diversity is maintained at the cost of inequality. It is because, as a Muslim, you know that you are superior to say a Christian Orthodox, a Greek, or an Armenian, or a Jew. Because you know you are superior, that you tolerate their presence. You don't see them as equals. You don't see them as part of the mosaic or whatever of your empire. You see them as submissive subjects of your empire, which you define in religious terms, as do everyone. I mean, well into the 19th century, most of the Balkan nationalisms were defined in religious terms before they were expressed as some kind of a national identity. This is true of Greece, of Serbia. It's true of Bulgaria, and it's true eventually of Turkey. I mean, Turkey pretends it's secular today, but ask anyone in the street. They will say that first and foremost, they are Muslims, and that Turkish citizens who are not Muslims, sure, they're citizens, they're Turkish citizens, but they're not really Turks, is the underlying notion. And therefore, you pretend that you have equality, but in fact, you have what Ottomans and Turks like most, which is equity, the beauty of equity, which they translate as adalet, justice, is that you can have equity even in a situation of inequality, as long as you treat people who you consider are inferior to you. And that includes, for example, slaves. I mean, the Ottoman Empire, until the very end, practiced at least domestic slavery. So for slaves, as long as you treat slaves properly, according to the rules of whatever laws there are, and this law generally is the Sharia for slavery, you're okay. You are being fair. You are being just. You are being equitable to them. But that doesn't mean that they can at any moment be your equals, because the concept of equality is not there. So this was, an introductory statement about the difference between an empire and the nation state, and the difference between the Ottoman imperial tradition of equity and that of equality as it develops in Europe and spreads throughout the world, at least in principle, as one of the bases of democracy.
This introduction is insightful because it highlights how much we study the past by imposing modern constructs. How would you then reflect upon the idea of the Ottoman Empire and the later state?
So, is the Ottoman Empire, how would you define the Ottoman Empire? My constant struggle with Turkish students at the university is to try to make them understand that the Ottoman Empire is not some kind of an imperial version of the Turkish nation, of the Turkish Republic, or whatever. There is, of course, some kind of a connection in time, but this is not some kind of a grandiose version of the Turkish Republic as you idealize it today, from a nationalistic perspective. And it's not either, it cannot be reduced to the notion of an Islamic empire. I mean, this notion of Islamic is extremely problematic. When you call the Ottoman Empire an Islamic empire, when you talk about the Islamic world, what do you really mean? That the majority of the people are Muslims? Yeah, but what about the others? What about the way in which the others are integrated into the everyday life of that polity? What about those regions, and there are plenty of them, where the majority of the people are not Muslims, but Christians, or even Jews? Look at Salonika in the 19th century. So obviously, and Islamic art is also one of these problematic notions. First of all, because it presupposes that everything produced in the Islamic world, quote unquote, is of some kind of a religious nature, liturgical use. But it means also that how are you going to qualify, for example, a Muslim tombstone that was carved by an Armenian artist, an Armenian artisan? I've worked a lot on tombstones, on funerary epigraphy, and I know for a fact that most of the production of carved tombstones, so stone carving if you want, was done in Istanbul at least by Armenian artisans. Armenian, Gregorian, later Protestant, whatever, but Armenian, Christian. So if a Muslim gets a tombstone, which is obviously Islamic because there are inscriptions that refer to religion, after all, it's kind of obvious. But if it was done by an Armenian artisan, are you really going to call it Islamic? You will if you think of the function, but then you're using one of the essential elements of art historical analysis, which is the making of the object, of the artifact, because you have a Christian doing it. You have the same problem with Byzantine art historical analysis or categories. The Byzantine art historians generally refer to whatever is produced in the Ottoman lands by the Greek Orthodox after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. They call it post-Byzantine art.
Yes.
Which is nonsensical. Why do they call it post-Byzantine? Because they associate it with the Byzantine Empire as, basically the political power that stood behind the Patriarchate. It defines it. And the real objective is not to call it Ottoman, not to call it Ottoman Orthodox or Ottoman Greek or Orthodox Ottoman or Greek Ottoman. Whereas, why wouldn't you? That's really what an empire is about. I mean, you have in the Balkans more than half the population, which is Orthodox, Greek in the religious sense of the word, which is a problem for the Bulgarians when they want to break free from the Greek Patriarchate and become a nation of their own. But, you have Greek Orthodox around the Balkans who are producing, much in the tradition, much in keeping with the tradition of earlier times, all sorts of artifacts that are, icons that are religious objects, objects of cult and liturgy that are directly inspired from the Greek Orthodox patriarchal tradition. But these are Ottoman subjects. They live under Ottoman rule. If you refuse to call them Ottoman, and if you insist to give them some kind of an abstract identity of post-Byzantine, that means exactly the same thing as Turks today talking about the Ottoman Empire as a Turkish empire, or using the word Turkish or Islamic for defining anything they want to study in the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't work that way. So the whole struggle of an Ottoman historian is, in a sense, to give the empire the possibility of, quote unquote, striking back, of talking for itself with all the complexity, the ambiguity, the confusion that implies.
It's wonderful that we're talking about all the societies that integrated the Ottoman Empire. For example, we keep referring to the Greeks, and I think this is a very relevant topic because if we remember, just before the corona outbreak, by January or so, there was a major sociopolitical issue in the borders of Turkey and Greece, in which waves of refugees were allowed to cross the borders, and it created this clashing between the European Union and Turkey. And it's very important, we're talking about the history of the Ottoman Empire, and I wonder how can we better understand this contemporary clash through historical eyes?
I don't think every current situation can be explained through history. I mean, it's one of the dangers of constantly, drawing parallels between the before and the after and linking every action of, say, a nation state like Turkey to its Ottoman past, or of Greece to its Byzantine, or to its Greek nationalist 19th century past, whatever. It's problematic. I mean, obviously, Greece and Turkey have a lot of history in common, a lot of bad blood too. After all, Greek independence in 1830 is one of the most brilliant cases of secession in a very conservative Europe that generally refuses to condone secession and defends the status quo. So it's a very iconic moment. And it's a slap in the face of the Ottoman to have to live from 1830 on with this tiny nation state, which is under European protection and which defies the authority of its former masters, quote unquote. Now, obviously, you can draw a parallel between that and the situation of Greece today in Europe, which is one of the arguments very often used by Turkey. Greeks being the spoiled brat of Europe and whatever. In fact, there are Europeans who say that too. But then again, I don't think history repeats itself. I don't think there are very solid patterns that will help you to explain everything that's happening today through history. But then again, there are breaks and continuities, and therefore, obviously, you have to look at history to understand what's going on. But the context of these refugees being used to a large extent by two nation states, and especially by Turkey as some kind of a threat against Europe, that's something that is very different from the Ottoman way of dealing with migration or dealing with displacement. The Ottomans have constantly used that within their own borders, using internal exile or deportation as a way of increasing the population of a region they want to develop. I mean, that's how they've, quote unquote, conquered Cyprus. That's how they've repopulated Istanbul and turned it into not an Islamic city, but a lively city, because, I mean, much of the population that they brought to Istanbul after 1453 was not Muslim, but Christian Orthodox. So it's not about sowing the seeds of a certain identity. It's about moving population around in order to do some kind of an engineering that works to the best of some kind of an economic and fiscal productivity of each area. And of course, you use it also in order to get rid of unwanted elements in certain areas, a bit like the British did for Australia. Most of the people who were deported to Cyprus after 1571 were criminals or people the Ottoman state wanted to get rid of from Anatolia. So messing with population, with demography, is part and parcel of the imperial way of dealing with this. But in this particular case of the Syrian refugees, and it's not even the Syrian refugees, because if you've noted, most of the refugees who found themselves in that no man's land between Greece and Turkey are not from Syria, but from Afghanistan, Pakistan, from further away. So it's not even what was really targeted at the beginning. But these are the playgrounds of the nations. And I always say that the nation state is much more violent than an empire. An empire kills, an empire massacres, but an empire does not commit genocide, which is one of the reasons why I do not consider the Ottoman Empire under Young Turk or under Unionist rule during World War I to be still an empire. Because if it commits genocide against Armenians, it means that it has already become a form of a nation state. It is using the ideological power of a nation state and not the kind of flexibility that characterizes an empire.
Thank you, Edhem. You briefly mentioned before the concept of the other, the exotic East, and I wonder, what do you think fed this idea in Europe about anything that's further away from the Balkans being the other?
Well, it takes, I mean, if you take Said, he will tell you that it goes back to antiquity, this division of Orient and Occident, of East and West. And it's probably true, although the dimension it takes during the early modern era, but especially during the modern era, is what defines our values today of East and West. I mean, if you look at the 16th century, you can say that the Orient starts in Venice, not in Constantinople, but in Venice. That part of Europe is already in the Orient. There are ways in which you can see the Orient, again, if you follow, for example, Nabil Matar, there's a lot of parallels drawn between the Turks, the Moors, and the American Indians. So this otherness as being, because I mean, Europe has this very self-centered vision of its little parochial world and the world outside as being totally different. So it's out there already in the 16th century, but it becomes a major issue in the 19th century, in the 18th and 19th century, with the Enlightenment, with the rise of this notion of Oriental despotism and using the Ottomans as an example of something that is contrary to human nature or to European nature in terms of politics and whatever. And in the 19th century, because of the tension created by what is called the Eastern question, that is, in a nutshell, what are we going to do with the Ottoman Empire if it crumbles and if it creates a vacuum of power in the region due to rivalries, especially between Russia and England and Britain? So on the one hand, you have that. And on the other, you have the constitution of the big colonial empire, the British and the French, and much later the German, which are very different from the colonial empires we know of in the 16th century, the Spanish Empire, or from the Ottoman Empire, in the sense that they are very clear in their distinction between the nucleus of their empire, which is the metropolis, la métropole, as you would say in France, that is the nation, where you have equality, where you have political equality defining the status of every individual. Britain is the same. And then you have the periphery, which is colonies, where people are differentiated racially, culturally, religiously, and politically, and legally. They don't have the same rights, and they are essentially others in terms of their color, in terms of their religion, in terms of whatever you can think of as some kind of an objective, quote unquote, distinction between the white man and the other. And that is really what creates the real Orientalism, the one that Said denounced, the one that is still very obviously present in the back of European minds, or in the back of Oriental minds of Turkey. I mean, that's the beauty of Orientalism. It spreads to the rest of the periphery of the world, and you have such a thing as Ottoman Orientalism, or the Kemalist revolution. The Turkish Republic is, to a large extent, an Orientalist project, in the sense that it starts with the notion that the West is the best, that we will follow progress, modernity, civilization, and that we will force the uncouth, uncivilized peasants of East Anatolia, the Muslim conservative elements, the Kurds, define them in whatever the others, those who do not belong to your enlightened little white world, you define them as the other, and you force them into submission to the rules of the game as they are set by the nation state, which, although anti-imperialist, is still very Orientalist, because it kind of appropriates the principles, the ideas of Orientalism. Even the Ottomans are like that. I mean, the Ottomans in the second half of the 19th century, when you read the correspondence of an Ottoman governor in Yemen, or in Baghdad, or in Basra, well, sometimes you get the impression that you're reading the correspondence of a British officer in India or a French officer in Algiers, because those categories of the barbaric Eastern individual who is frozen in time and cannot get out of it without the intervention of modernity and whatever, you end up internalizing it yourself. So that's the power of Orientalism. So we shouldn't be surprised that it's still out there, that it's still, and it's very funny to see that Orientalism and nationalism, Turkish nationalism especially, because that's what I know best, kind of converge to a large extent, because they end up agreeing on the uniqueness of Turkishness. I mean, the Europeans are the ones who, until the 20th century, have called the Ottomans Turks, with all sorts of ambiguities, you know, Turk meaning Muslim, Turk meaning racially, ethnically, religiously, and whatever, at a time when the Ottomans never used the term. The Ottomans the only way they would use Turk or Turkish is to define the nomadic tribes of Anatolia or further who were of Turkoman origin, and it wasn't really a compliment. So it's the Europeans, in a sense, that have invented Turkish identity as a quote-unquote national identity. And of course, Turkish nationalism, or Ottoman nationalism of a Turkish Islamic creed, when it developed at the end of the 19th century, it kind of jumped on this notion of Turkishness in order to invent its own nation. So therefore, Oriental perceptions of the uniqueness, the essential nature of Turkishness and whatever, is something that is, in a sense, shared by Turkish nationalism, which considers that Turks are better and whatever, and that they are distinct of Europe. So there you have it. If your nationalism kind of dovetails into the same definition of your uniqueness, and therefore cuts any possibility of converging towards some kind of a more universalistic understanding of culture and whatever, there you have it. You have a perfectly Orientalist situation that works in both ways. And of course, Orientalism is used by nationalism as a form of victimization. You know, everybody in Turkey, without even reading Said, will know about Said and say, oh, yeah. Europe has been spending centuries constantly criticizing the Orient and whatever. So you turn it into a third worldist kind of claim to your autonomy, your independence, and your victimization at the hands of the big bad wolf, which is, you know, Europe and imperialism. It may be true to a certain extent, but you shouldn't reduce that to such a caricature of a much more complex situation.
I feel it's very useful to have this juxtaposition of historical analysis of Orientalism as a concept. And I feel that we could be discussing a lot more about it because it's extremely current. That's definitely something we take a lot of consideration within Converging Paths when we are working on our program. But we need more than half an hour for that. So before we run out of time, I really want to hear about you and about what you're currently working on.
Well, I'm working on that's the advantages, the privilege of seniority. So I'm working on several projects at the same time, which is sometimes dispersing, but sometimes very interesting. I have a long-term project which involves the publication of the memoirs of an Ottoman prince in the late 19th century. This is a very unique kind of material. I've already published the first volume. I'm working on the second, and this is going to go as far as probably 8 or 10 volumes. So that's one documentary, if you want, project. I'm working on the history of archaeology in the Ottoman lands, which is another way of addressing the issue of Westernization on the Ottoman front and Orientalism on the European front, to see how ruins become the battleground of these ideologies and claims to modernity. And the most immediate thing I'm doing now is I'm finishing a book that I promised to a French publishing house, and that's going to be of interest to you, I suppose. It's on the Alhambra. I'm doing a book that is based on the converging views of Europe, the Maghreb, that is mostly Morocco, and the Orient, which is mostly the Ottoman Empire, on the Alhambra in the 19th century. The starting point of this investigation was the discovery I made online of the visitors' books that were made available to visitors to the Alhambra from 1829 on, where they could drop a line about their impressions and sign. And it's a fantastic source where you discover that there were tens, sometimes hundreds of quote unquote Orientals visiting what had become already one of the most iconic elements of Western Orientalism in art history, but also in literature. So it's a fascinating way of looking at these cross readings of the same monument by people of diverse backgrounds, and try to connect that to a general understanding of how Orientalism works. In the Spanish case, I mean, what the Spaniards called the leyenda negra, it's Orientalism in many of its aspects. It's not just some kind of a plot of the Protestant North against the Catholic South and whatever. It's also, especially in the 19th century, it's something that is embedded in an Orientalist vision of Spain, and especially of Al-Andalus, of Andalusia. To me, it's fascinating. I've already published an article on the Ottoman side of this, and trying to make sense of how they viewed it, what their intellectual baggage was to appreciate the Orientality, the Arabness, the Islamic identity of this monument. So that's really what I'm working on. I'm supposed to finish this by the end of the month.
It is very engaging to talk to you, Edhem. I think it's these reflections on concepts of historicity, and as you mentioned, particularly the Alhambra is a good one. I was raised in Spain, and I remember that our history books for 800 years of Muslim rule in the peninsula, only 2 pages were devoted to it, and it highlights this imbalance in between ideologies. And I think the way you have presented your ideas has been extremely illustrative and articulated. I wish we had more time, it sort of feels we're having here the privilege of having a masterclass with you. So I really want to thank you for sharing your time with us today. And of course, on behalf of the Barakat Trust and the rest of our sponsors, we hope that you're able to come to London after the lockdown is lifted and that we can hear more about your ambitious research. Certainly something we're looking forward to.
Sure, I'd love that. It was fun. Thank you very much. And more in the future.
Thank you, Edhem. And of course, finally, I want to thank our listeners, as every week they are here with us. And they are making questions, they're writing to us, so please do write to us. You can find my email on the website. Please subscribe to our newsletter. There's always a very exciting content. There are feature movies, other talks that have been recorded, interviews, recipes, all sorts of variety of things that to make your isolation process a bit more joyful. I look forward to sharing a little bit of time next week with you. And until then, I hope you all keep safe and stay well.
You were listening to the Arts in Isolation podcast, brought to you by Asia House. For more information, please visit our website, asiahousearts.org.